Hi, welcome. We're here to tell you a story about a river with a snapshot.
Repeated. And this is about the San Juan River, which you can see was scoured to the bottom here. Well, okay, scoured in 1890s.
So we'll talk about riparian vegetation change in response to altered flow regimes and geomorphology on the San Juan River. I'm Cynthia Dott.
And I'm Gary Giannini, and we're at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado.
We'd like to start by acknowledging that the land where we speak from today at Fort Lewis College and the region where we study this beautiful river is the ancestral land and territories of the Nuchu, Apache, Pueblos, Hopi, Zuni, and the Diné Nation.
We think it's important to provide this acknowledgement because the narratives of this land and region have long been told from one dominant perspective without full acknowledgement of the tribes who lived on this land.
Thank you for your attention and respect in acknowledging this important history. So our big question is, how did this, on the left,
and what you can see there is the scoured channel of the San Juan River with small vegetation in 73, sorry. And then 47 years later, this year, turns into this jungle in the same stretch.
So here's an outline to that answer. We'll give you a little bit of the geographic setting and then talk about geomorphology and hydrology, and then use that as a way to explain the sequential waves of vegetation colonization we've seen along this river and end with some takeaway points. This is the study area in the red box near the town of Bluff, Utah, and you can see there's Fort Lewis College on the Animas River in Durango as part of the San Juan drainage. Our study area extends from just upstream of Bluff down to right above Lake Powell on the San Juan River.
And this is a Google Earth image. And we want to highlight three types of canyon reaches for you. Alluvial reaches with broad floodplains, like you see here, shown in blue. Bedrock canyon reaches, highlighted in yellow here, as in this long reach here. And then those that are influenced by Lake Powell sediment out here in red.
The alluvial reaches look like this. They're wide floodplains, not really constrained by bedrock. And in this case, lots of room for the river channel to move back and forth, at least before vegetation, versus the constrained canyon reaches, which are about an order of magnitude smaller, narrower, and they're constrained by bedrock and often have bedrock channels and minimal sediment.
So when we think about the hydrologic setting of the San Juan River over the last 120 years or even a little bit longer, there are two main things that you want to notice. One is these large floods, like 148,000 CFS in 1911. And note that as we go forward towards the future, those just stop. And the biggest thing we've had since 1980 is around 20,000 to 22,000. So that's a major thing. The other thing in the bottom of this slide is that we have these alternations of wetter or drier than average periods. And important for plant establishment, as it turns out, was the Dust Bowl period here in the 1930s.
Okay. So to look at that hydrographic record a little more, here's the record of peak flows on the San Juan River. And you can see that pre-dam, the peak flows were about twice as large as they now are post-dam. It's pretty impressive. And then if we look at minimum flows, notice that minimum flows after the dam are about twice as large on average as they were before the dam. And during that Dust Bowl period, sometimes the river dried up. So I'd like to talk now about sequential waves of vegetation colonization in four sort of different time periods. The earliest time period is really setting the stage with scouring floods. Then we go to a period that was drier than average. Then we go to the post-dam period, which included a wetter than average period. And then we get to the present time where we find ourselves in the midst of a mega drought.
So here are some of those, again, here's that same alluvial reach. And in the late 1890s and really into the early 1900s, these huge scouring floods that cleaned the alluvial reaches. And here's another picture of the alluvial reach right near Bluff, Utah. See this very, very wide, unvegetated floodplain, just little, probably willows right along the edge.
And then if we move down river a little ways, now we're looking upstream on the San Juan from near Butler Wash. And here we are in 1961, which is pre-dam still, but after most of that really dry period. You can see that there are cottonwood stands that are more dense along the shoreline. And on the islands and bars, we're starting to have colonization by willow and tamarisk. And the timing of tamarisk arrival in this area is a little uncertain, but probably sometime between the 30s and 40s. If we stay at this location now and jump forward in time to 2020, notice, it's pretty obvious, a huge change in vegetation. Now we're many years post-dam and we're into this period of sustained low flows. We still have cottonwood stands, they're much larger now, lots of Russian olive, that light greenish gray color, and some tamarisk is visible there. Now, if we move downstream a little ways further, we're at a popular hiking location, and here we are in 1961, so we're pre-dam again. And you can see in the background on that point that there is some tamarisk colonizing, probably some cottonwood and willow as well. But notice that the beaches are still fairly open. If we stay at this location, but now go to the river and look back towards that same shoreline, this is a photo from NAU's Klein Library donated by George Billingsley. There's George with baby Ryan and his wife Susan. In 1978, you can see that we're now post-dam. It's been a part of a wetter period. The cottonwood stand is fairly well established. There's tamarisk, zone of tamarisk. And most important in this image are the young Russian olive trees becoming established on the bank. If we stay at this location now, keep an eye on that knob and go to 2020, you can see that the Russian olive is now hugely dense.
Okay, and if we also stay in the alluvial reaches and look here, just 3 years after the massive 1911 flood, you can see that this alluvial reach, it's just about to enter the canyon, but this alluvial reach is completely scoured with a few surviving cottonwoods. If we move forward in time to 1979, you can see there's a lot more vegetation, big cottonwood groves here, and then the sandbars are becoming stabilized and colonized by tamarisk and willow. Probably some small Russian olives out there, but we can't resolve those in this view. Then I went up on this on a Four Corners Geological Society field trip, and we took some pictures. And this shows the amazing encroachment of Russian olive in this side of the valley. You should note that if you go on this side, you need a permit from the Navajo Nation to hike.
Now let's move to the canyon reaches. And here's an 1894 photo showing that the scouring floods that were happening during this time period scoured the canyons too, and really left no vegetation, just these beautiful sandy beaches. If we stay in this location but move down to river level, here we are looking upstream from that same general location. And even in the 1950s, we're still pre-dam, but quite a bit of time has passed, there's no vegetation. If we now move to 2020, there's a lot of shrubby vegetation along the banks, mostly willow and tamarisk, some phragmites, and occasionally also Russian olive down in this part of the canyon. Tamarisk in this part of the canyon, based on tree ring counts established around 1968.
So in the bedrock sections of the canyon, this is pre-dam but post-drought, you can still see that the canyon is quite scoured, and there might be some small willows trying to establish here. But note where this man's head is. And if we come to this fall, Cynthia is standing where that fellow was. And it's a very, very different view. Phragmites right along the river, mostly coyote willow here, and a few dying tamarisk up high.
Based on ring counts, the oldest willows we see in this lower part of the canyon probably became established around 1997.
And then in the area that's influenced by Lake Powell sediment, which is actually built up, and river sediment has also built up in here. There are these amazing plant communities that are stabilizing the bars. And this is mostly willow and baccharis. And here a very, very large Russian olive. And what's amazing is these appear to be being chewed by porcupines.
Indeed. So to sum up those waves of vegetation colonization, we had frequent large floods in the early period, including that 1911 flood. And during that time, some cottonwoods survived, but towards the end of the flood regime, cottonwoods became established on the shoreline and expanded. Willows started colonizing the bars and islands as the large floods subsided. And sometime during this period, during drier conditions, tamarisk also began to colonize those bars and islands. After Navajo Dam, we see tamarisk establishing down in the narrow canyons. And Russian olive shows up, interestingly, pretty soon after Tropical Storm Norma caused a big flood on the San Juan in the 70s. Russian olive was probably there already, but that flood probably washed seeds in from upstream, and we saw a big increase in density. And then lastly, the most and an interesting new development is that we have more willow establishment down in the narrow canyon reaches, we think as a result of lower flows and no big floods to scour them away. Tamarisk is dying back in that portion of the canyon, and we're now seeing more willow and even Russian olive now showing up down in the canyon.
And probably part of that willow establishment or encroachment now is because of the higher low flows during the summer months.
Right. So part of the answer to how we got from this to this
is this decrease in scouring floods, which we showed you data on. Part of that's because there's Navajo Dam upstream. Part of that is nature doesn't appear to be dishing up the huge storms that we had at the beginning of the last century.
And the drier than average conditions that we've had a few different times during this period have permitted initial vegetation growth and bank armoring. And then the higher minimum flows kind of further the growth of that vegetation on the banks.
So the net result of these combined factors, both geomorphic and hydrologic and vegetative, is that native and exotic woody vegetation has greatly increased along the San Juan River corridor.
So some takeaway points. Dense riparian vegetation is likely here to stay. Even if we did get a large scouring flood, it would take a lot to remove that vegetation. So how we plan and manage in this system is going to determine whether it's dominated by native species like cottonwoods, or whether it will be dominated by non-native Russian olive, which we've seen expanding exponentially in the time we've been spending on the San Juan River. So with that, I think we will pause for questions.
And thanks so much for listening to our talk. And we'll go to questions, and we'd welcome your thoughts and questions. So this is us doing field work on the San Juan, and that's one of our field assistants down here.
Thanks so much for your attention.